The fog rolled in off Lake Ontario the way it always did in late October, thick and low, swallowing the streetlights whole until all that remained were pale smudges in the grey. Hazel Park was the kind of neighbourhood where the coffee shops closed at 9, and the neighbours left casseroles on your doorstep when something went wrong. It was not the kind of place where black SUVs with tinted windows idled at the curb for 20 minutes without moving. Iris Vane noticed the vehicle the moment she turned off Lakeshore Boulevard. She noticed most things other people didn't. That was both the gift and the quiet burden of growing up the way she had, with a father who believed that attention was the only armor that mattered. He'd taught her to read a room before she walked into it, to count exits before she found a seat, to listen to what people didn't say as much as what they did. She'd thought for a long time that it was peculiar the way he raised her. Now, at 28, standing on a cracked sidewalk with a nursing bag over one shoulder and her hair damp from the mist, she understood it had been something else entirely. She didn't slow her pace. She cut left at the corner, looped past the dry cleaners, and watched from the reflection in its darkened window as the SUV pulled forward without turning its headlights on. So they knew where she lived. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian on Balmoral. She took the stairs 2 at a time, locked the deadbolt, and stood in the dark of her kitchen with her back against the wall and her phone in her hand. She didn't call anyone. There was no one to call. Not now, not about this. Instead, she pulled up the photograph she'd stored in an encrypted folder, the one her father had sent her 3 weeks before he died. A spreadsheet. Columns of names and numbers and dates, all of them encoded in a system she'd spent the better part of a decade learning to read. Not because anyone told her to, because her father had taught her music theory before he taught her anything else. And the encoding system he'd built was structured exactly like a fugue. Theme, inversion, retrograde, augmentation. She'd cracked the first layer when she was 17. She'd been too afraid to look at what was underneath it. She looked now. Dr. Harlan Reed was not a patient man. He hadn't been since the age of 11. When he'd sat across a boardroom table from his father's lawyers and watched them divide his family's assets like butchers working through a carcass, and learned that the only people who won were the ones who moved before anyone else realized the game had started. He'd spent the next 25 years proving the lesson correct. At 36, he ran 3 legitimate pharmaceutical companies, and one that wasn't, a private security operation with contracts across 4 provinces, and a consulting network that various federal ministers had learned not to question. He had the kind of face that made people in service industries smile reflexively, and then feel vaguely unsettled afterward, as though they'd smiled at something that hadn't warranted it. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that catalogued and categorized without warmth. He had been called handsome in profiles he'd never read. He had been called other things in rooms he was never meant to hear about. He didn't particularly care about either. What he cared about, at this precise moment, was the fact that someone had accessed a secondary server belonging to his logistics arm. A server that was not supposed to exist, that was not listed anywhere, that even his own board of directors didn't know about, and left a single file in its root directory, a music file. 12 seconds of piano. No metadata. His head of security, a former CSIS analyst named Brecht, who had the permanent expression of a man who'd stopped sleeping sometime in the early 2010s, had placed a printed transcript of the audio notation on the desk beside his coffee at 6 that morning. "Where did it come from?" Reed said. "We're working on it." "That's not what I asked." Brecht was quiet for a moment. It came from inside the network. Someone with deep access, the kind that shouldn't exist. Reed looked at the notation. 12 seconds. 7 notes. He wasn't musical. He didn't know what he was looking at. But he knew what it meant, because he'd seen this pattern once before. In a file his own father had locked and labeled, and then apparently shared with someone he should never have trusted. The file had belonged to Gerald Vane, who had been his father's accountant for 19 years. Gerald Vane, who had built the encoding system that sat at the center of everything Reed's operation had inherited. Gerald, who had died in a car accident on the 401 3 weeks ago, and whom Reed had been quietly relieved to never have to deal with again. Gerald Vane, who apparently had a daughter. The community health clinic where Iris worked occupied the ground floor of a building on Dundas West that smelled of industrial cleaner and old carpet. She'd taken the position 18 months ago after finishing her second nursing degree. The one nobody knew about. The one she'd done remotely through a school in Halifax while working full-time. The first degree was registered. The second, in forensic medical examination, was technically valid but entirely absent from her official employment file. Her supervisor, a kind and perpetually overwhelmed woman named Mrs. Okonkwo, believed Iris was an exceptionally observant nurse with a gift for difficult patients. This was true. It was also approximately 30% of the full picture. Iris moved through her Tuesday morning the way she always did, efficiently, without drawing attention, watching. The clinic saw a broad range of patients. Construction workers with repetitive strain injuries, elderly residents managing chronic conditions with inadequate prescription coverage. Occasionally, and this was the part nobody mentioned out loud, individuals connected to operations that operated outside the boundaries of what Revenue Canada was aware of. Dundas West had layers. Iris had learned all of them in the first 6 months. She was in the middle of changing a dressing on a man who'd introduced himself only as Fernie, which was not his name, she was reasonably certain. When the clinic door opened and the particular quality of silence that followed told her something had changed in the room. She finished the dressing, taped it, told Fernie he was done, and watched him leave without looking at whoever had come in. Then she turned around. There were 3 of them. 2 stood near the door in the practiced stillness of men who were paid to be elsewhere in the room at short notice. The third was sitting in the plastic chair nearest the window with the precise stillness of someone who had never once sat in a plastic chair in his life, and was managing the experience with great internal effort. Dark coat, no visible security lanyard or badge, which meant the kind of authority that didn't require one. He was watching her the way she watched rooms cataloguing, and when their eyes met, something shifted in his expression so briefly she almost missed it. Almost. "Nurse Vane," he said. Not a question. She picked up her chart. "The clinic has a 30-minute wait unless it's an emergency. You can check in at the front desk." "I'm not here as a patient." "Then I'm afraid I can't help you." She started toward the next curtained bay. "The waiting area is to your left. Your father sent you something before he died." She stopped. Her hand was still on the curtain. She was aware of exactly where the 2 men near the door were standing, aware of the secondary exit through the supply room, aware that Mrs. Okonkwo was in her office with the door closed and would not come out for another 40 minutes. She'd been aware of all of that from the moment she'd turned around. She let 3 seconds pass. Then she turned back. "I think," she said, keeping her voice at its professional register, "that you should speak to our clinic administrator. I'm sure she can help you find the appropriate Firis." Just her first name. The way he said it wasn't threatening. It was something stranger than that. Like the word was an acknowledgement of something he hadn't expected to have to acknowledge. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Sit down," he said, "before your colleagues notice this conversation is unusual." She assessed him for another moment. Then she pulled the curtain closed behind her and sat in the chair across from him. His name, he told her, was Harlan Reed. He did not offer his hand. She did not tell him she already knew who he was. She'd known since the night she'd cracked the second layer of her father's encoding system and found his name nested at its center, like the seed of something that had been growing for a very long time. He told her there had been a breach, that someone with access to a system that couldn't be breached had left something in it. He told her this in the clipped, efficient language of a man who was accustomed to being the most informed person in any room, and was finding the current situation an adjustment. He did not tell her he was afraid, but she could see it. Not in his face, which was nearly impenetrable, but in the small things, the way his right hand rested flat on his knee, deliberately still. The way he'd chosen the seat with the wall behind it and sightlines to both exits. The way he'd said her father's name. What was in the file, she asked. Music. What kind? A pause. Piano. 7 notes. She felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was the feeling she imagined a person had when a door they'd been standing outside for years finally opened. And you want to know what it means, she said. I want to know how you got into my system. I didn't say I did. You didn't say you didn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the curtain, the clinic made its ordinary sounds. Wheels on linoleum, a phone ringing at the front desk. Mrs. Okonkwo's radio murmuring something in Yoruba. Normal. Safe. The world she'd built here. Piece by careful piece. My father, she said finally, was the most careful man I've ever known. He spent 19 years building something that he believed was airtight. And then he found out it wasn't, and he knew what that meant for him, and instead of running, she stopped, looked at her hands. He spent the last 4 months of his life making sure I had everything I needed. Raid was very still. The encoding system he built, she continued, has 4 layers. I assume you've found the first 2. We have analysts who... Your analysts have found the first 2, she said, not unkindly. The 3rd layer requires familiarity with a specific compositional technique that isn't widely taught anymore. The 4th, she paused. The 4th is not recoverable without the key, and the key is not stored anywhere that your people will find. The 2 men near the door were too far away to hear. She kept her voice low anyway. The file I left in your system, she said, was a message. It was 7 notes from a back partita that my father used as a personal cipher. It means I know what's in the ledger, and I know what was done to make sure he couldn't talk about it. Something moved across Reed's face that she hadn't expected. It wasn't anger, it wasn't calculation. It looked, briefly and entirely unexpectedly, like something close to shame. Who else knows you have it, he said. No one. That's not, she said again, who is still in a position to use it. He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. She'd spent a long time preparing for this moment, and she'd imagined it many ways. And in none of the versions had she imagined the man across from her would look at her as though she was the first person in a decade to say something that surprised him. What do you want? He said. That depends, she said, on whether you knew. Knew what? Whether you knew what your operation did to my father, whether you ordered it, or whether you inherited it, or whether you're standing here right now because you just found out and you're trying to decide if you can contain it. She held his gaze. Those are 3 very different situations, Dr. Reed, and I need to know which one we're in. The silence stretched. Outside, the phone rang again and was answered. Someone coughed in the waiting area, October pressed against the clinic windows, grey and indifferent. I inherited it, he said. I found the accounting records 8 months ago. The ones your father flagged, he paused. I didn't know about your father until 3 weeks ago, when he died, yes. She watched him. She was very good at knowing when people were lying. Her father had taught her that too, though in his case the lesson had been theoretical. Hers had been practical. 4 years of clinical nursing, 2 of forensic work, and a long education in the gap between what people said and what their bodies couldn't help doing while they said it. Harlan Reed was not lying. That complicated things considerably. She didn't go home that night. She'd learned from her father that the moment someone knew where you lived, that location became a liability, and she'd spent enough time thinking about this particular scenario to have prepared for it. She had a bag at the clinic, a second one, small, tucked behind the fire extinguisher in the supply room. Change of clothes, a burner phone, the kind of cash that doesn't require a transaction record, and a small encrypted drive she'd been adding to for the better part of a year. She went instead to a furnished room she rented under a different name on the Danforth. She sat on the edge of the bed, and she let herself be still for exactly 5 minutes. Then she opened her laptop and began to work. The ledger her father had built was not a simple accounting document. It was a map of transactions, relationships, favors owed and debts concealed, stretching back 15 years and touching people whose names appeared in newspapers and on donation plaques outside hospital wings. Her father had spent nearly 2 decades building it, and he'd encoded it in layers because he understood that the information itself was a weapon, and weapons needed safeties. She'd removed the first safety when she was 17 and immediately put it back. She'd removed the second when she finished her first nursing degree and understood for the first time the full scope of what she was holding. She'd removed the third on the night she got the phone call about the 401. Now she sat in a rented room in the East End of Toronto and dismantled the fourth. What she found underneath it was not a surprise. She'd suspected. She'd built her suspicions carefully, tested them against everything she could access, refused to let herself be certain until she was certain. Now she was. There were 3 names at the center of the ledger. The 3 who had built the arrangement with her father, who had benefited from it, who had decided that a careful man who knew too much was a problem that could be solved with weather and an icy highway. Harlan Reed's name was not among them. She sat with that for a long time. He came to the Danforth room the next morning. She hadn't told him the address. She'd left a note in the same server she'd accessed before. 7 more notes, a different key, a location. She wanted to know if he had the resources to decode it without her, and she wanted to know how long it would take. It took him 6 hours. She was almost impressed. He arrived alone, which she hadn't expected. He knocked, which she also hadn't expected. She'd braced for the sound of his security team in the corridor, but there was nothing. Just 1 set of footsteps, and then a pause, and then 2 measured knocks on the door. She opened it with the chain still on. He looked at the chain. A small muscle moved in his jaw. "You came alone," she said. "You encoded the message for 1 reader," he said. "I understood that." She closed the door, removed the chain, opened it again. He stepped inside and looked at the room with the same cataloging attention he'd given the clinic. Exits, sight lines, the laptop on the table, the encrypted drive beside it. His gaze paused on the drive. "Is that it? Part of it. The rest? Somewhere you won't find without my help." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair at the small table and sat down. Just like that, sat down, in a furnished room on the Danforth, in the same deliberate way he'd sat in the plastic clinic chair, like a man making a decision by sitting in it. "I want to know everything," he said. "I know, and I want to know." He stopped, started again. "I want to know what you need from me to make this work. Not what you want, what you need. There's a difference." She looked at him. He was watching her with that dark, careful attention, and she could see again the thing she'd glimpsed in the clinic. The faint fracture behind the composure, the evidence of something like conscience operating in someone who'd spent years trying to keep it at a minimum. "I need protection," she said. "Not your men standing outside my door. Something with legal standing, the kind that makes me difficult to disappear. I can do that. I need access to the individuals whose names are in the ledger. Real access. Not through intermediaries. Some of those individuals, I know who they are," she said. "I need access anyway." He was quiet. "And I need you," she said, "to understand that when this is finished, the ledger becomes public record. Not used privately, not leveraged quietly, public." The silence in the room was very dense. "That will damage my operation," he said. "I know. Significantly. I know." She held his gaze. "I also know that your operation contains sections you built and sections you inherited. I know the difference between them. The ledger reflects that difference." Something shifted in his expression. She had the sense, strange, and she examined it carefully, that she was the first person in a significant amount of time to offer him a distinction he'd stopped believing anyone else could see. "You've had this for how long?" he asked. "In usable form, about 3 weeks, and you didn't go to the RCMP. The ledger names 3 individuals in that building," she said. "I went to the clinic instead." He exhaled. It was the first entirely uncontrolled thing she'd seen him do. "All right," he said. "All right, all right." He placed both hands flat on the table, the same deliberate stillness she'd clocked the day before. "Tell me where you need to start." The weeks that followed were the strangest of Avirus Vane's life, and she had a reasonably competitive field to draw from. She kept working at the clinic. Mrs. Okonkwo noticed nothing different. The patients came and went. Fernie, twice more, still not giving his name. An elderly woman named Mrs. Apostolopulu, who always brought homemade kuluri and left 3 on the desk without comment. A teenager named Josh, who was pretending the laceration on his arm was from a kitchen accident and was not, and whom Iris sat with for 20 minutes after the dressing was done, until he admitted what it actually was, and she gave him the number for a support line and made him put it in his phone before he left. The ordinary work. She loved it. She'd chosen it specifically because it kept her in contact with the part of the world that operated at human scale, and she needed that. Needed the reminder that most things were small and real and mattered in immediate, tangible ways. It was easy to lose that when you were carrying something the size of what she was carrying. Harlan Reed, she discovered, was a complicated person to understand. He was not warm. She wasn't sure warmth was in his register in any natural sense. There was something in the way he moved through interpersonal interaction that suggested it had been deliberately removed at some point, or perhaps had never developed in the way it did for other people. But he was precise. He was honest in a way that occasionally startled her. He said uncomfortable things with the same flat directness as comfortable ones, with no apparent awareness that most people softened bad news. He showed up when he said he would, and he didn't. She had expected, in the versions of this she'd imagined, to stay afraid of him throughout. She found that she didn't, not because she decided to trust him, but because the evidence accumulated in one direction with the stubbornness of data, and she was someone who respected data. He kept his word about the legal protection. The nature of it she declined to examine too closely. She suspected it involved entities she'd rather not know the details of. But it was real and it was effective, and she slept somewhat better for it. He gave her access to the 3 individuals in the ledger. This took longer and was less clean. There were meetings in buildings she'd never been inside, rooms where the light was too flat, and the furniture cost more than she made in a year, and where the people across the table had the practiced warmth of individuals who had learned that warmth was a tool and deployed it accordingly. She sat through those meetings the way she sat through difficult dressing changes, attentive, precise, giving nothing that wasn't necessary. Reed sat beside her. He didn't speak for her. He didn't need to. On the 3rd occasion, a dinner at a private dining room in a hotel she'd previously only seen from the outside, one of the 3 men at the table, a man whose name she'd first read in her father's encoded file when she was 22, leaned across the white tablecloth and said something to her in a voice pitched too low for Reed to hear. He said, "Your father was a very intelligent man. It would be a shame if his daughter weren't similarly cautious about where she kept her records." She looked at him. She said, "My father was also a very patient man. You might want to consider whether that runs in the family." Raid, across the table, was watching her. She didn't look at him. She picked up her water glass and took a small, unhurried sip and watched the man across the table reassess everything he thought he knew about her, and she felt something in her chest that her father would have recognized. He had felt it too, she thought. The long patience of someone who has been building towards something for a very long time and can finally see the end of it. The night it ended, it was snowing. Not the soft, picturesque snow of Christmas cards, but the flat, wet, exhausting snow that February produced in Toronto, as though to remind everyone that winter was not romantic. It was simply long. The kind of snow that turned sidewalks to grey slush and made the TTC run 20 minutes behind, and collected in the hoods of jackets in a way that was consistently, specifically unpleasant. Iris stood outside the offices of the CBC on Front Street and watched a man she'd never met, a journalist whose name she'd chosen after 18 months of research into who could be trusted and who couldn't, emerge from the building with a USB drive in his jacket pocket. The drive contained everything, the full decoded ledger. Documentation connecting it to 3 specific individuals, supporting records her father had collected over 19 years, which she had supplemented over the past 14 months with documentation of her own. It was thorough. Her father had built it to be thorough, and she had finished what he started. Her phone buzzed. "Reed, are you there?" She looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed, "Yes." The ellipsis appeared and disappeared twice before he responded. "Reed, and?" She typed, "It's done." She watched the journalist disappear through the glass doors of a parking structure across the street. The snow fell steadily. Somewhere behind her, a streetcar rumbled past on King, sending up a fine grey spray. Her phone buzzed again. "Reed, come inside. It's -12. She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the coffee shop across the street. One of the ones that closed at 9, except it was 7:53 and the lights were still on. He was holding 2 cups. His coat had snow on the shoulders. She thought about her father, who had not been there to see this, who had built the architecture of this moment over 19 careful years and had not lived to stand in it. She let herself feel that for exactly as long as it needed to be felt. Then she crossed the street. He handed her the coffee. She wrapped her hands around it. The cup was very warm, which she hadn't realized she needed until she had it. They stood in the doorway, and she looked out at the snow covering the city. The wet, dark streets, the ordinary evening traffic of a February Tuesday in Toronto. "They'll come after you," she said. "I know, and the operation is already restructured, has been for 3 months. He was quiet for a moment. "There's a version of this that survives. The parts I built." "I know." She'd seen the restructuring. She'd helped shape it, in the quiet margins of everything else, because the ledger named the parts that needed to go, and she'd been precise about it. "That's why I was precise." He looked at her. She looked back. There was something in his expression that she didn't have a clean clinical category for. Not warmth, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had the shape of warmth and was learning, she thought, to be the real thing. "Your father," he said. "Yes, he would have. He would have been very annoyed," she said, "that it took this long." Reed made a sound that was, she realized, a laugh. Small and controlled and clearly unpracticed but genuine. She felt something shift in her chest. "He would have been right," Reed said. She looked out at the snow. "He usually was," she said. That was the problem and also the point. The city moved around them, ordinary and unhurried, indifferent to what had just ended and what might, carefully, begin.